So in this video, we are going to talk about the signs of all the trig functions. So I have the first quadrant, the second quadrant, the third quadrant, and the fourth quadrant. This is my y-axis and this is my x-axis, and we're talking about the unit circle. So my radius is going to be 1. Now if I had an angle, and I sweep that angle open, starting at the positive x-axis, so it's in standard position, and it lands, that terminal side lands when it sweeps open in the first quadrant. Then that point on the circle that it intersects, my terminal point, I would have an x value and a y value. If you recall, my y value is equivalent to the sine of that angle, and my cosine of that angle is equivalent to the x value of that ordered pair. So when I'm sitting in the first quadrant, my cosine is going to be positive and my sine is going to be positive. Now we can derive the other trig functions using sine and cosine. So we'll be able to figure out the signs of those trig functions. Since secant is the reciprocal of cosine, if I have a positive number, which is cosine, and I take the reciprocal, it's still going to be positive. Same thing with cosecant. If I take sine, which is a positive number, and I take the reciprocal, which is cosecant, that's going to give me a positive value. Tangent is when I take sine over cosine. And so in the first quadrant, I would have a positive over a positive because both sine and cosine are positive. So tangent would be positive. Then cotangent is when I take cosine over sine. And either way, I would have a positive over a positive, which would give me a positive value. So in the first quadrant, if I swing an angle open, that terminal point that intersects with the unit circle is going to give me trig functions that are all positive. Now looking at the second quadrant, if I have a point in the second quadrant, my x is negative but my y is positive. Since my x is equivalent to my cosine of that angle, in the second quadrant, if my angle swings open, my cosine is going to be negative. In the second quadrant, my sine, which is my y value, is going to be positive. Since secant is the reciprocal of cosine, when I take the reciprocal of a negative number, it's still going to give me a negative number. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So since sine is positive in the second quadrant, when I take the reciprocal of sine, I'm still going to get a positive number. And tangent and cotangent are both negative in the second quadrant because tangent and cotangent are ratios of cosine over sine or sine over cosine. And because one is positive and one is negative, when I divide those, in both cases, I'm going to get a negative value. If I'm looking at a point in the third quadrant, both x and y are going to be negative. So that means cosine and sine are going to be negative. Because cosine and sine have reciprocals that are secant and cosecant, both of their reciprocals are also going to be negative, because when I take the reciprocal of a negative number, it is also negative. However, tangent and cotangent in this quadrant are both going to be positive because cosine and sine are both negative. And when I take sine over cosine or cosine over sine, since both of those are negative and I have a negative divided by a negative, I'm going to get a positive. If I have a point on the circle in the fourth quadrant, x is positive and y is negative. So that tells me that my cosine, which is my x value, is positive, and my sine, which is my y value, is negative. Since secant is the reciprocal of cosine, that is also going to be positive, and cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, so that will be negative, since reciprocals maintain the same sign. tangent and cotangent are both going to be negative. Since sine and cosine are opposite signs, when I come up with my ratio for tangent and cotangent, and I have a positive divided by a negative or a negative divided by a positive, I'm going to get a negative in both cases. So this is a nice little chart you can refer to until you get comfortable with these trig functions to help you determine where the angle sweeps open. You look at what quadrant it is in, and then that will help you determine the sign of the function.